So, hello again, ladies. The next PowerPoint is basically government intervention to exploit positive externalities. This is basically PowerPoint number 6 of 9 in total, which covers the CC8 booklet. Okay, so we're going to be looking at from page 50 onwards in your booklet. Okay, so we're going to be looking specifically at two things during this presentation. One is subsidies. So subsidies to try to exploit and encourage positive externalities, and also maximum prices. Okay, so that's what we're going to be covering in this particular session. So let's, without further ado, let's crack on. So let's take a look at subsidies then. What are they? Well, they're basically an amount of money given directly to firms by the government to try and encourage both production and consumption. Okay, so what happens is, generally speaking, a subsidy is given to the producer to actually, or in some cases also the consumer, to encourage consumption. And in this instance, a unit subsidy is a specific sum per unit produced, which is given to the producer, but also in some cases it can also be given to the consumer, as we'll see. So what does that do? What it does, if we think about it from a graphical perspective, and I'm just going to move myself a little bit further out of the way so we can see, then effectively the effect of a unit subsidy is to shift the supply curve vertically downwards by the amount of the subsidy. So in this case, or in a scenario such as this, there's a new supply curve that will be parallel to the original. And obviously very much dependent on the elasticity of demand, that if the effect is that's going to reduce the price to the consumer, and hopefully as a result of that it will increase output, and also it will increase the amount of people who are going to consume that particular good, particularly if we've got a positive externality that we're talking about, and trying to somehow find this social optimum where we're actually encouraging people to do more good things for them, if you like. So let's move on and take a look at what that actually means then. Okay, so there are some examples in your booklet, as you'll see, where this is a typical example of a government subsidy that encourages an increase in supply at each price level, because essentially what the subsidy does is allows the firm's cost of production to be reduced. And in essence, the extent of the subsidy is shown, particularly for a subsidy per unit, is shown by the vertical distance between the two supply curves, as you can see. Okay. Now, clearly, you can interpret this in a number of different ways, looking at the original equilibrium and the new equilibrium when we've got the supply plus the subsidy, and also we can see the supply or the subsidy per unit that is being applied in this situation. And the questions that are posed here, what is the change in price, what's the change in output, and shade the area representing the total cost of the subsidy, are all things that you should quite easily be able to do. Okay. Again, we could also talk about who's benefiting. Is it the consumer or is it the producer that is benefiting from this extra benefit? And that's something, again, that we will need to consider. Okay, so thinking about this then, thinking about the way in which this can apply, we need to think about PED, so the elasticity of demand for these products or services. Okay, so clearly, if we get the extent to which the benefit of a subsidy is going to be felt by consumers rather than producers is going to depend very much on the price elasticity of demand for that particular good or service. And in some instances, we've got, and you'll see on page 51, that you've got some options for you to consider where you've got inelastic demand, and then you've got elastic demand, and then drawing in the two subsidy or the supply curve with the subsidy included, and then the extent to which that is likely to have an effect on the amount of product or service demanded. Okay. Now, there are some quite nice guides to completing those graphs on page 51. So follow the four examples, or follow the instructions that are given there, and also try and answer those questions. So the other thing that we've got to bear in mind also is that there is going to be some sort of principle that we need to bear in mind as far as the producer is concerned. Okay, so again, the extent to which this benefit of the subsidy is felt by consumers rather than producers will depend to some degree on the price elasticity of supply. And again, there are some examples for you to complete and fill in on that basis to demonstrate how this process works. Okay, there are a number of different activities that are included in the booklet as well on page 53. There's quite a nice drawing provided for you on the use of subsidies to exploit both welfare, the potential welfare gains of positive externalities. Remember, we talked about welfare gains, and that there is quite a nice example given and drawn in your booklet on page 53, again with a number of questions for you to complete. So try and get familiar with how this whole thing works, but that the worked example on page 53 and drawing in the areas and highlighting the areas and labelling the areas on the diagram on your graph would certainly be a very positive thing to do. So the next thing we're going to consider then is the economic arguments against subsidies. Okay, so essentially we're talking about evaluating whether subsidies are a good idea or a bad idea. And on page 55, 54 and 55, you've got an evaluation of subsidies where you've got a fill in the gaps type article where you've been given some missing words and you need to slot those into the article that has been provided on page 54. And then you've got the option also to consider the advantages and disadvantages of subsidies. And what we've done here is just sort of highlight a few examples, a few things that you could bear in mind. And again, in the same way as when we talked about the use of taxes and other options as far as trying to reduce negative externalities, we've also got to bear in mind the issues around the economic arguments against subsidies. So, for instance, we've got to bear in mind that whilst a subsidy seems to be a good idea, we've got to think about the economic efficiency and fairness or equity of that particular subsidy. So who's going to gain from that particular subsidy and who's going to pay for it? And it might well be that the money, the opportunity cost of using that money for a particular subsidy means that it might be better spent elsewhere. So clearly we've got to bear that in mind, and in the long run, got to think about are the better ways of producing or providing financial support for both producers and employees in specific industries rather than just subsidising. Because one could argue that if you're subsidising an industry in some shape or form, then they're not really standing on their own 2 feet in terms of competing within a free market and making sure that they are actually being competitive and both nationally and internationally. So some free market economists argue that subsidies essentially distort the workings of the free market mechanism, and that obviously in some instances that could lead to government failure, particularly if the government intervention, maybe through lack of information or poor information, might lead to a worse case distribution of resources than with the subsidy. And like we said before, if we're talking about export subsidies in particular, that's going to distort the free market for exports and trades in goods and services. And that obviously can be an issue in terms of both less economically developed countries, countries, being able to compete in markets of industrialized countries. So one could argue that is going to essentially going to, in some cases, encourage some inefficiencies maybe within businesses that are getting subsidies because they're not having to really stand on their own 2 feet in order to secure business and revenue and profits from their consumers. Um, so there again, further arguments in terms of how you might be able to sort of talk about subsidies and them not necessarily being a good thing, and to some degree we've sort of touched on those previously. So in some instances, which groups or industries are going to receive a subsidy? Is that an arbitrary thing? Should tourism be supported? Why not the steel industry? One could argue at the moment with the pandemic, etc., we've got the aviation industries and the hospitality industries are desperate for assistance to try to improve matters, but in some instances that may not necessarily be the best option. Where are those financial costs going to come from? Clearly, if we're going to if the government's going to finance those subsidies, then that's going to have to come from tax revenues, and obviously the use of that tax revenue for subsidies means it can't be used in other areas. Who's going to pay and who benefits? Again, where will that final cost of subsidy fall? Will it fall on consumers who are the taxpayers, even though they may not necessarily derive any benefit from that particular subsidy directly? I mean, and as I mentioned before, it can encourage some economic inefficiency, i.e., you're protecting inefficient firms who might actually be better served restructuring rather than just benefiting from a subsidy. And that clearly needs to be borne in mind. Clearly, with any sort of subsidy payments, there's always going to be the risk of fraud and a bit of corruption in there as well. And in some cases, some of those subsidies can end up with overproduction going on rather than actually the most efficient use of resources. Clearly, again, we need to think about the other things that are available. What other alternatives could you consider? Maybe rather than just providing a subsidy and dependent on what the objective of that subsidy is, maybe providing direct income support through the tax and benefit system might actually, in some cases, be a significant improvement. For instance, that might be an example. Could be. I don't think it should be framers. I think that's probably farmers. Sorry about the typo there. Rather than giving subsidies, maybe you could be giving them more direct support. So the next thing to consider then on page 55, you've got a data response question, you've got an extract included in your booklet on page 55 and some tables for you to consider. And also then you've got a question, a 15-mark question, evaluate the likely benefits of an increased subsidy for bus and rail travel and use an appropriate diagram to support your answer. So given that we talked about subsidies, clearly you could use one of the diagrams that we've already just talked about. You've also got some information explaining what the index is based around. So that's 1996 values. And then you can also consider the costs of different forms of travel and also the variation between that and average gross weekly household income and also bus travel. So you've got some information there. And then effectively, we've talked about that question there. I'd like you to have a go at planning that, okay? And then what we've also done then is included in the next few slides some examples of how you might go about answering that particular question, okay? So obviously you've got the PowerPoint on Teams. You've also got your booklet that you can use, and obviously there's narrated PowerPoint should you want to use them too. So let's take a look at how we might go about answering this particular question then. And I'm not going to read this verbatim as such, but I'm just going to try and explain how we've gone about it, okay? So the question is, and again, remember, always be looking for those command words in the question. We've got to evaluate the likely benefits of an increased subsidy for bus and rail travel. And we've been told we've got to use an appropriate diagram to support our answer. So we must make sure we use a diagram. And also we need to think about the benefits, but also maybe some of the disadvantages to an increased subsidy for bus and rail travel. So the benefit, clearly, what first benefit, so we could think about it in this way, think about how that benefit is going to give some credence to this increased subsidy. So in some cases, we may find that commercial companies are not going to be willing to offer a service for certain routes if they're not particularly profitable, but that can have a huge impact on residents and local communities. So, in some instances, these subsidies will help lots of individuals in those areas. Okay, again, thinking about how that might work and the UK labour market relying on buses for the mobility of labour as an example, particularly at the lower end of the market, you could argue that that again is about trying to provide further benefits, or as I say, further benefits, further reasons for people to use bus and rail travel in order to make their uh, situations and their job prospects significantly better. So clearly, in this instance, you might find that firms would find it difficult to hire workers if they were unable to travel to work, and so you can then see that that could actually create obviously a socially difficult scenario where we've got lots of people unemployed because of a lack of affordable travel. So that's the first benefit that you could talk about. If we then take a look at how we could evaluate that, so we've been told we've got to evaluate it. So one of the things that we could do is talk about how subsidies are actually quite costly in financial terms, and we can show in this instance the financial cost of this subsidy being P1CAB. So it's clearly there is a cost involved. Okay. Now, that subsidy is obviously going to be funded by taxpayers. Some people, many of the taxpayers may not use public transport, so they're essentially not gaining any benefit themselves, or the consumers or the taxpayers are not gaining any benefit themselves. And also, there's that significant opportunity cost because with government funding being a fairly current, or this is a current issue, isn't it? But where do they spend that money? Should it be on the NHS or education? Because if there's lots of subsidies being paid for public transport, then obviously that money can't be used or magic out of the air and put into another set of spending options for the government. And again, we've got a diagram there which actually shows that supports your answer. Okay, if we then take a look at the second benefit, okay, now in this instance, one could argue another benefit of increasing public transport is that cars and lots of cars and on the road cause pollution and also road congestion. And obviously, if we're using buses and trains, for instance, that can reduce both congestion and carbon emissions. And so, one could argue from an environmental perspective, they're a much better option than cars. And if you change the relative price of the bus and train travel, that's essentially going to mean that could reduce the negative externalities caused by cars on the road. And again, using the figures and the data that you've been provided on page 55 in your booklet, talking about that and how you can relate that information. Clearly, in this instance, if we use the data from figure 2 that's included, that shows that the cost of car travel has gone up by less than inflation, and bus and train travel have gone up by more than inflation. And that clearly could justify the increased subsidy because it then makes it a better environmental scenario if we actually encourage more people to use buses and trains through these forms of subsidy. So hopefully you can start to see how you can build an answer by using benefits and then evaluating them. And if we take a look at evaluating that second point, the only issue between that is, or the only issue that we've got to consider is that it's quite difficult for the government and local authorities to decide how much to subsidise and which services to subsidise. So if the subsidies are too high, it might lead to some inefficiencies in the bus and train provision, and companies may not need to keep their costs down to survive. And you could argue that that inefficiency is basically going to be a waste of public funds as a result. So next question to consider then. Okay, so that was the bus services question. The next question I'd like you to consider is the arts subsidies question. So in this instance, there's another 15 marker, and we've done the similar sort of thing here, where using the data and your knowledge of economics, evaluate the view that providing subsidies is the best way to ensure that sufficient resources are devoted to the arts and cultural activities. So, in a similar vein to the bus services question, we go through the same sort of process for for that. That's another typical question. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about art subsidies, another 15 marker, and you can use that same principle in order to answer that question. So what I suggest you do is have a go at the question, but again, I've given you some ideas of how you might be able to structure your thought process. Again, similar sort of method applied, I suppose, to that bus services question. Okay, so in this instance, we've got a scenario where the first point could be that if we were encouraging opera, ballet, and theatre companies, they wouldn't survive without subsidies. And one could argue that that art and culture enriches people's lives, and it should be. It's a very important thing to encourage. So, as a result of that, the educational benefits of arts and theatre mean that the marginal social benefit outweighs the marginal excuse me, production benefit, and as a result of that, the cultural activities would be underprovided because the market wouldn't actually provide them without the use of those subsidies in the first instance. Okay, so subsidies would lead to lower prices, and that would enable those on lower incomes to be able to access the arts. So clearly, in this in this scenario, then obviously as we mentioned, the marginal social benefit is higher than the marginal private benefit, and as a result of that, that would be a point for justifying the use of subsidies to try to encourage arts and cultural activities. So again, diagram fairly similar again, where we've got in this instance the use of both marginal private benefit, marginal social benefit, the difference between the two, the marginal social cost being drawn in there as well, and then the welfare loss being highlighted. Okay, so the free market allocation of resources as far as the arts were concerned would be at PQ. Okay, that would be our equilibrium point, but we're saying that the marginal social benefit is significantly higher, and the marginal social cost is significantly higher at this socially efficient allocation point. Okay, so again, that's something that we could use to support the argument that we're just talking about. In terms of the second point that you can include, in this instance, we're saying that that there is a sort of form of almost multiplier effect in that a pound invested in the arts, up to £6 is generated elsewhere, and people who attend those theatre productions and art galleries also spend money in restaurants and hotels in and around the London area, for instance, the London theatre area. It draws overseas tourists and creates a wider benefit to the economy from supporting the arts, and also it creates significant employment options as well. Okay, so in some cases, that's that initial subsidy. You might think, well, why should we do that? It's not particularly efficient. Well, actually, when one thinks of it in a slightly wider sense, it clearly can have massive benefits by supporting the arts. So looking at some of the drawbacks then, again, we've mentioned that in some cases, subsidies are going to essentially allow producers to raise their costs, so they might actually choose to be spending in a wasteful way. And in that instance, obviously, if that means that prices may not necessarily be lowered for consumers if there's any sort of inefficiency in production. If that happens, then clearly subsidies are not really helping because they're not reducing the prices to consumers, and then effectively those people that we're targeting, those on lower income, may not necessarily be able to benefit from the subsidy, in this case for theatres. Second point, alternatives then, okay? Thinking about how we might be able to consider different ways of funding the arts. So business sponsorship could be a consideration, or you already find at the moment large organisations, large companies who want to be seen to be doing the right thing and in improving their PR and public relations activities might choose to sponsor art exhibitions and other cultural events. And you also find that some rich benefactors might actually support things like the National Gallery, for instance. So, in some instances, and there are examples of very, very famous and very successful festivals, and in this case, the Glyndebourne Opera Festival operates without a subsidy. So one could argue that maybe taxpayers wouldn't need to provide funds which have this significant opportunity cost, and one could argue that those people that tend to go to the opera are relatively wealthy, and so taxpayers' funds should be better used by services for us all, like the NHS as an example. Okay, so another example there of how we might go about answering questions on positive externalities and how we can try and encourage them through subsidies. Okay, but an understanding of that area is clearly going to be quite important for you. There are a couple of short questions that I'd like you to have a go at as well. Okay, they're in your booklets on page 56. And in this instance, we've got a diagram showing government grants and subsidies to manufacturers of loft insulation. Okay, so the shifts in the market supply curve are shown, and then the total amount spent by the government on subsidies is going to be represented by one of those areas, A, B, C, or D. So have a go at that, see which one you think it is, and then pop that in your booklet. Another example of a typical type of question, typical multi-choice question, which one of the following statements about subsidies is most likely to be correct? So a subsidy could do one of those four things, and obviously it's a process of elimination. Give that some thought, see which answer you think is the correct one. Okay, so the next thing then to consider. So we talked about subsidies as a way of the government intervening to exploit positive externalities, but one can also use something called maximum pricing. We mentioned use of minimum pricing to try to reduce negative externalities. But in this instance, we might also, to exploit positive externalities, apply some maximum price points. Okay, so where we set a price ceiling rather than a price floor. Okay, so in this instance, then this is how it works. So effectively, what we're saying is that if we believe that the market equilibrium at the moment is significantly at a very high point for some reason, either supply or demand or both are significantly higher than we think they should be in a free market scenario, we might actually insist on a maximum price being set, which is below our equilibrium point. Okay, so in essence, there's an extension of demand and a contraction of supply in that scenario. Okay, and in some cases, and the housing market is a classic example here, it tends to be used when the government or a regulator sees the going market price as being too high. And in essence, essentially, we're saying that in this scenario, we're going to try to address the issue around the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied in order to reduce, in some cases, the overall price of a good or service. Okay, so again, on page 57, you've got some examples, and you've got a place for you to complete that graph, and also then some examples and some questions for you to answer on page 57, and also consider the extension activity of what the impact on consumer and producer surplus would be of this particular type of policy. Okay. So, if we then take a look at the maximum price for houses, now this is on page 58 and 59, 58 in particular, on this issue around the maximum price for housing. Okay, so going back as far as 2004, and these areas that are included on the slide here are also included in your booklet. Okay, so there's some information, some data that you can use to try to consider the arguments for and against a maximum price for houses. Okay, so without reading this verbatim, there's some information there which tells you what was going on in 2004, where we had a rapid rise in house prices, and in essence, with that being a significant, or the prices of housing going up significantly higher than virtually every other product or service. The issues around that, whether people could afford to get on the housing market, how was that fueling levels of debt within the economy, and also consumer spending, because clearly, if you've got high levels of mortgage payment to make, then that's going to mean that you've got less money to spend on other things. So, in some instances, although we haven't actually used maximum price legislation, in peacetime, certainly rent controls are certainly being considered, and again, both rent and the price of houses to buy, but also to rent, are clearly a significant issue to bear in mind. And obviously, that is a fairly significant investment on anybody's part to buy or to rent a house. So it's something that is probably going to come up again, but understanding this principle of how a maximum price for housing might work and what the benefits would be and the arguments for and against. Again, the arguments for are it means that more people can come into the market. The arguments against clearly is that effectively causes the free market mechanism and the price mechanism to not necessarily work in the most efficient way in terms of the free market allocating resources. So the free market view, very much like we just described, the Adam Smith Association being very much a great proponent of the free market view. One could argue that the market should be allowed to settle at their equilibrium level, because that's going to give us the most efficient allocation of resources. Okay, so whilst that may be the case, society may not be convinced that the minimum wage is a good thing for the economy, and is concerned that some people have recently suggested we need a maximum price limit for houses. So those questions that are being posed there, may be a way in which you could then consider how you might use the price mechanism, why the price mechanism provides the best and most efficient allocation of resources. And clearly, dependent on where your politics lie, and I've used the term politics with a small p, what your political view might be, then that clearly, and whether you believe in the free market or some sort of government intervention, that will clearly colour your judgment in terms of the way you might answer that question. But whenever you're giving an opinion, try and give a balanced opinion, and then suggest why, give evidence as to why you believe your view is the correct one, with good evidence and examples where you can bring them in. Okay, so the other thing to bear in mind, we've touched on it briefly, and we've certainly looked at it in earlier parts of the booklet. This is this principle of provision of information. Okay, so the government is clearly very keen to encourage people to eat better, to exercise more, to make sure they get themselves vaccinated against potential killer diseases. And this information is clearly another option. And some of the campaigns that you'll see on TV, virtually every time that you turn on the television, these public information films talking about 5 a day, talking about change for life. It's about actually providing information, and also one could argue it's a little bit of behavioural economics coming in here, where you're nudging people to say, you need to eat well, you need to move more, you need to live longer, and here are the reasons why. So the provision of information is another means by which we can either do one of two things: either address negative externalities, or more importantly, encourage positive externalities. So here are the reasons why you should do this. Here is some information which tells you how you can improve your scenario. Maybe the the way in which you eat, the amount of weight that you could lose on the basis of making these changes to your life. Clearly, provision of information is a very important part of government policy too. The last thing to bear in mind is obviously regulation. We've talked about regulation again previously, but again, this principle of regulation, because we've got positive externalities for certain things, so education being the example, then in some instances the government might use regulations to ensure all can benefit from education. And why would regulation be a suitable policy in this scenario? Well, in this case, clearly, if you've got to stay in full-time education for a certain period of time, then that means that hopefully the human capital that we are providing for firms in the future, and also for us as individuals, means that we're probably going to be able to provide better skills and better skilled and better prepared uh, workforces in the future. So that clearly, again, regulation can be seen, although we talked about that being about addressing negative externalities, then there are also some positive externalities that regulation can actually be used to help overall. So that's the end of this particular presentation, and hopefully that makes a bit of sense in that we've covered a number of things about exploiting positive externalities, specifically the use of subsidies and also the use of maximum prices, but also the provision of information and to some degree regulation as well for encouraging positive externalities. So thanks once again for listening. Hope that makes some sense, and we'll talk to you next time.